Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. YouTube blocked access around the world to channels that are associated with Russian government-funded media, including RT America, which provided shows hosted like the likes of Chris Hedges, Oliver Stone, Abby Martin, and my guest Lee Camp. YouTube cited its policy barring content that denies, minimizes, or trivializes documented violence events, and has said that Russia's invasion of Ukraine fell under its violent events policy. Lee Camp hosted the program on RT America called Redacted Tonight. He was laid off after RT America shut down on March 1st after it was dropped by numerous cable and satellite providers. Spotify also stopped platforming his podcast that's called Moment of Clarity. YouTube still has his page that's dedicated to that show, once again called Moment of Clarity with Lee Camp. You can also find Lee Camp on Patreon. He joins me over Zoom. Lee Camp, thank you for taking this time to join me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. These are interesting times, to say the least.
Yeah, almost I was going to say unprecedented times, but I guess if we go through the history of the Cold War, we find similar times and what happens to media during times of war. And it definitely feels like this is one of those moments. Tell me your version of what has happened these past 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know who have never heard of me or heard of my TV show or anything that it's a comedy news show. I'm an American in America covering American news, and that's why I was brought on to RT America. But I wrote all of my words. I researched everything myself. I hosted and wrote the show for 8 years, 375 episodes, and I was never told what to say. I was never censored in any way. And that is why I was at RT America. It's really, it was just about the only national television airwaves where you could be fully anti-war, fully anti-imperialist, the way I am, and be allowed on television. I very clearly said that I was opposed to Putin's invasion, but I also gave context for how we ended up here, the expansion in NATO, the 2014 U.S.-backed and Nazi-backed coup in Ukraine, etc. So you can understand that how wrong it is to create war anywhere and be opposed to it, and also be willing to be intellectually honest and understand the context of the events we're seeing right now. But all that being said, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, basically everything was running fine. There was no hint that RT America was going to shut down after, I don't even know how many years, maybe 15. And then the next day they said, no programming today. We'll have a meeting tomorrow. And we come in for that meeting and they say everything's done. And, good luck. Which to me means, and I don't have any inside knowledge, but to me it means it had to be U.S. sanctions in one form or another that ultimately crushed it because they had enough money to keep running at least for a while. They had enough staff to run, multiple, if not all of the shows. So I think it must have been some U.S. sanctions that caused it to be impossible to keep putting out content. And there was no sign or no mumblings that it was coming back or anything. So I think this is a very dangerous time. I mean, if our society is so weak that it can't handle opposing viewpoints that are almost everyone there, anti-war, anti-imperialist, if they can't handle that, then that's a sad state of where our press and where our freedom of speech is.
In preparing for our conversation, I went to go try to find some of I've seen your show over the years a number of times, but I went to go try to find some recent shows just to see exactly what you were saying, and lo and behold, I couldn't find them. I went to YouTube, and it's just not that you're not broadcasting today anymore. It's that all your previous shows are no longer available on YouTube.
Which speaks to an even larger problem, which is this the power of big tech. And when they have been told, or I guess they could have just decided themselves, that they want to erase someone from the airwaves, erase a channel, the particular Redacted Tonight channel had 240,000 subscribers, had thousands of videos, had been going for, like I said, 8 years. And to just erase all that, it's basically banned globally. As far as I've heard, no one can access it anymore. That's a very dangerous precedent to set. And I know we're not the first. I mean, there's been over the past 5-6 years, there have been multiple examples of people being deleted from some of these big tech platforms. And, it's not something that should be celebrated. It's something that people should fight against. And yet you don't hear a peep from most of your, mainstream cable news channels that they believe there should be any form of press freedom. Apparently, they all seem fine with this.
Does RT have its own streaming services? Was it entirely, now again, it was a cable show as well, and it was dropped by a lot of cable providers, and I think that's probably, though I guess you haven't been told definitively, that's probably likely what led to it shutting down. But for online consumption, was it relying entirely on YouTube?
No, they had a separate platform. I think it might still be up, called portable.tv, but obviously there's no new content being created, which, again, is what makes me think that they could be deleted from YouTube and they would have kept functioning because they had a large online presence. But obviously some decision the U.S. made it impossible.
But they haven't told you exactly why they shut down?
No, as far as I know, they didn't tell any of the employees or shows.
Yeah. Your podcast was also taken off Spotify. Was your podcast connected to your show that RT broadcasted?
It was only connected in the sense that I used some of the audio from Redacted Tonight. Since I wrote and delivered all the audio, I made that part of the podcast. So, but other than that, it is owned by me. It was created by me. That podcast was going long before I joined RT America. But I'm guessing Spotify, just maybe did a search for audio coming from at some point coming from RT America and just deleted anything that came from that. And again, there's no warning, there's no email. Hey, if you think this is incorrect, let us know. It is just the purging of reality, a portion of reality. It's no one's ever accused me of lying or making things up. I'm sourcing all of my information, and so it's kind of just both hilarious if it weren't so dark to just see things erased from multiple platforms at once. And what is so dangerous about having someone who is fully anti-war and anti-imperialist? What is so dangerous about that, unless you want to continue that type of behavior, unless you want to continue the countless wars that we create overseas, unless you want to continue the deaths in Yemen, 377,000 to date that we're helping fund and arm, unless you want to continue that type of activity, then this information shouldn't be so dangerous to you, but it seems that it is.
Did Spotify give you an explanation for taking down your podcast?
Not that I know of.
Yeah. But YouTube has kept your other page that's connected to your podcast, I guess a video version of it, on. It hasn't taken that down. Do you think the reason is that it wasn't necessarily directed at you, but more directed at RT, which reportedly is funded by the Russian government?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was mainly directed at RT America and RT America shows. Largely, that seems to be what was done. However, beyond just the deletion of various platforms, I've been essentially shadow banned on my personal page, shadow banned on Facebook for 4 or 5 years now, ever since 2016. I have a large Facebook page that I worked very hard for 10 years to build up. It was one of my main platforms. And then suddenly, 2016, I can't gain any followers, and my posts are shown to, less than 1% of my 330,000 followers. So you're basically building up, for those people building things on social media, you're basically building up something on quicksand. I mean, the foundation can just be eroded instantaneously, and it seems to be there's no consequences for it. There seems to be no real large court battles that have had any success in saying, hey, if you're going to have people on your platform and they're going to work very hard to build something up, then you can't just rip it out from under them, out of the blue without any, I got no warning, no emails from Facebook. As far as I know, I never had any, whatever they call them, community guideline strikes. I wasn't posting Nazi photos or anything. So it's just insane that we have these massive. I mean, Facebook is basically like a second internet. It's so popular and so widely used, and these massive platforms that can just decide, one day, yeah, well, let's destroy that entire platform for that person, that entire income, etc.
Yeah, and especially around the world, Facebook is the internet for a lot
Yeah.
of people. Lee Camp, I want to go back to YouTube's statement for taking down all of the RT videos that was on YouTube. It cited its policy barring content that, quote, denies, minimizes, or trivializes documented violent events, and that Russia's invasion of Ukraine fell under that policy. And I suspect, again, I went back to try to find out for sure, but none of it was available. But I suspect one would find host and guest that were giving perspective of Russia's experience in this, including, as you mentioned, NATO expansion, alleged Nazis in Ukraine, and that the Maidan protests were a Western U.S.-backed coup. Now, you can find these statements in these views in other places as well, including on this radio network, on the Gray Zone. There's other places you can find this, but of course they are not supported by the Russian government. And so YouTube was making a policy, kind of reminded me the policy it made towards the January 6th events that happened, its response after January 6th events, for if you are a part of a violent action and then trying to justify that violent action, we're taking your material down.
Well, of course, these statements from YouTube are hilarious on their face because our mainstream media in general, the CNN, Fox News, what have you, and first of all, I'm not agreeing that I ever denied any violence. I didn't deny any violence that was going on in Ukraine, but actually I only had one show after Ukraine began where I could even mention it because we were taken down so quickly. But all these mainstream media outlets, they're of course denying the mass violence done by the United States around the world. Wars and bombings that are barely ever covered. I mean, how many reports do you get on the deaths in Yemen? How many reports do you really get on the deaths going on right now in Afghanistan from our economic war on them? Yes, I'm not saying there's never been coverage of Afghanistan, but it is a tiny percentage of deaths covered in other ways, or deaths covered going on right now in Ukraine. And so they are denying, the mainstream media largely is denying the mass death being done by the United States. The latest estimates are that due to our war on terror over the past 20 years, 6 million people have died. That's 1 million direct deaths and 5 million indirect deaths. And how much of that has been covered by our mainstream media? Another irony of this is Chris Hedges, the famed Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent for the New York Times, had a show at RT America. Why was he at RT America and not at the New York Times? Because around the year 2001 or two, he came out against the Iraq War. The New York Times did not like that. You couldn't be against the Iraq War in that time, and so they forced him out. So at that time, he was forced out of an outlet because he was not willing to deny our war crimes and to deny what the United States was involved in. Now he's supposedly being, had the outlet of RT America crushed because they claim RT America is denying the violence. But again, I dare anyone, I mean, not that you can find it anymore, but to watch RT America and say, oh, it was one viewpoint. It was one pro-Russia viewpoint. That very much wasn't true. You had left-wingers like me and Jesse Ventura and Chris Hedges. There were many right-wingers on the network as well. The only thing that I could see that even remotely united us was that almost all of us were outside of the Overton window, the acceptable, allowable corporate talking points of most media outlets in the United States. That was kind of the thing that a little bit united us. By the way, Jesse Ventura, the ex-governor of Minnesota, he was also kicked off of mainstream airwaves for being anti-war. A lot of people don't know that he had already signed a contract with MSNBC to be one of their main faces, main shows. And the Iraq war was about to happen. And they found out he was anti-war and asked him to change his opinion. He said no. And they, according to him, paid him upwards of $10 million just to get out of his contract, just to make sure he would go away and not be anti-war on their networks. So it's hilarious for YouTube to say that, oh, we take down anything that minimizes or covers up violence, when, of course, that is the job of our mainstream media with most wars.
Yeah. Larry King was on RT America as well, the longtime radio host and TV host on CNN. I definitely hear what you're saying about not being told what to say. Others have told me the same thing, including Chris Hedges, who's been on this radio program a number of times over the years, and even recently. He has told me the same thing. Could one argue, though, that they didn't need to tell you what to say or bring people on because they already knew sort of the perspective and the critiques, especially towards the USA, that everyone has? There's obviously nothing wrong with that, but the fact that it was funded by the Russian government, who doesn't have a great track record with journalism in its own country, that what would its own motivation be towards funding a platform that is, I think one thing that you disagree with me here, but it seems like one thing that does unite the right and the left on the program is criticism towards the U.S. government. I mean, could we say that Russia was just being concerned about good journalism in America?
Well, I would say that you're right in the sense that, yes, I get that I got a show there because I'm anti-war, which, let's face it, most of the bombing and most of the wars that have gone on around the world in the past 20 years have involved the United States, at least large-scale bombing. And so by being anti-war, I'm largely critical of the United States, both because they're one of the biggest perpetrators. Let's be honest, with the largest military in the world, close to $1 trillion if it spent a year, if you count the black budget, just insane amounts of money, insane amounts of weaponry dumped into war every year. And so by being anti-war and also by being American, it makes sense that I am heavily criticizing the largest war creator in the world, the one in which I live and am born and grew up in. So yeah, I can get that's why they gave me a platform. But are we going to argue that anti-war voices, anti-military should not be given a platform in the United States? If there was a long list of television airwaves on which my thoughts would be allowed, then I would have been at one of them. But they don't exist in the United States, which I think, rather than just pointing fingers at other countries, Americans should look around and go, why is it we don't allow these type of conversations? Why is it we don't allow people that are really staunchly anti-war, anti-imperialist? Why can those discussions not be had on our mainstream airwaves?
What about Russia's motivation for doing this, though?
Well, I told you that they want to give a platform to maybe those who are criticizing Americans criticizing America to some degree, but I don't see a problem with that. And if there were any other network in which I could do that in America, then I'd probably be there. I don't think there should be a problem with having anti-war voices.
You have been critical on your show on RT America about Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, I said I was opposed to the invasion. And in fact, the segment I was going to do like I said, so we film 2 days before it actually airs. So we're filming on like a Wednesday, and the invasion of Ukraine, it started a little bit kind of that Wednesday. And so there was a little bit of confusion as to what exactly was going on. Most people didn't really know. So I only really had kind of a half an interview where I could even address it. I was planning on doing a segment. It was already written and prepared to be taped on war, and I clearly say in it I'm opposed to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And it was, but all of that was stopped before I could get a chance. And I did videos online. I did YouTube videos, which people can go watch, where I said similar things, same things.
Well, tell me your perspective of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
My perspective is that all war is wrong, essentially, and that I'm opposed to Putin's invasion. I'm opposed to the war in Ukraine. But the part I don't think we're getting from our mainstream media is that, and in fact, you can go to various policy reports where they knew they were doing this. The expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, talks with Ukraine into bringing them into NATO, shipping missiles to Ukraine. all of these things, the 2014, Nazi-involved coup in Ukraine that we were very supportive of. And you can read some of this at mainstream news outlets. Yahoo News did a report on the CIA funding Nazis in Ukraine. All of this has led to this moment. And you can understand the context of something and not approve of what the result is. I don't think Russia should be invading Ukraine. I don't think this war should be going on. But I think it's just intellectually dishonest. And, we're not adulting if we if we can't have a discussion as to why we pushed it to this point. And I think that if you saw the equivalent around the United States, if you saw a military alliance with Russia that was 17 countries surrounding the United States, and then you saw a Russian-backed coup in Mexico putting in a Russian-favorable government, and Russia was sending missiles and arms and funding to that Mexican government, which had Nazis on the border of the United States that were killing Americans, I think that America would not respond very well. But apparently we are acting shocked that one of the largest militaries in the world is responding poorly to this situation.
Can RT America be compared to something like Voice of America? Now, Voice of America is global. I guess RT America was specifically in the United States. Of course, not online, but could it be? But Voice of America is funded by the United States government. It claims it has a firewall of editorial choices. However, its president is nominated by the president, and is confirmed by the Senate. But could this can be compared to Voice of America, RT America? Can they be?
I mean, I think there's some comparisons to be made in terms of where the funding comes from, but I don't listen to a lot of Voice of America, but my understanding of it is that it very clearly is kind of the American propaganda about most of the world, whereas, like I've said, at RT America, I am an American writing all my own stuff, never been told to say anything or not to say anything, and continued to do all of my reporting and my, I mean, it was a comedy show, but it was a comedy show with journalism in it. Continued to do it all myself and had never been censored. So I think that's very different from what goes on at Voice of America.
Yeah. Voice of America was founded in 1942, originally meant to combat, according to itself, so put that caveat there, to combat Nazi propaganda that was occurring during World War II. After World War II, it turned its attention to the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviet Union began broadcasting itself in countries' languages to these countries. The Soviet Union responded in other countries that were receiving these signals by actually scrambling those radio waves. Is this something, and we sort of seen this happen there, and now we're seeing it happen with RT America. Is this something that you think just happens with war? I mean, obviously you're feeling the brunt of it. This was your job. This was your way of getting your work out there. Suddenly it's gone. So for you, obviously it's devastating, and other journalists as well. But do you think this is sort of a product of what happens in war?
Well, in one sense, no, because we've been at war for how long? Maybe ever? I mean, it's been a long time since the United States was not bombing somewhere, did not have military bases in other countries, was it 800, 900 around the world? So we're always at war. It's just a decision of whether the United States wants to make that war into the mainstream media's, 24/7 coverage. So in a way, no, this is not what always happens in war, because we're always at war, and it just started happening, at least to RT America. But in another sense, yes, this is what happens in war. If you look back in America's past, the American government, the American media, some of the American public do everything they can to shut up anti-war voices in times of war. I mean, you saw in the lead up to the Iraq invasion, just a mass anger and frothing at the mouth against anyone who dare say that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, that there was no reason to just obliterate whole cities in Iraq, killing, hundreds of thousands. As of 2008, which was a long time ago, the Lancet Medical Journal said 600,000 had been murdered in Iraq by our bombs and missiles. And in those early years, you really could not be, like I said, Chris Hedges purged from the New York Times, Jesse Ventura purged from MSNBC, Phil Donahue purged from MSNBC. You could not be opposed to war. So, yeah, in that way, it is what happens. If you are anti-war, if you are opposed to bombing and killing around the world, then you will be purged from the airwaves. And sometimes, depending on how adamant you are, you will be arrested.
I do think, and you were on Jimmy Dore's show earlier last week about all of this. We have other outlets like Gray Zone. Some shows on Pacifica Radio, I think, also take a very, not so different perspective than you were finding on RT. That they're still here, and I'm sorry to keep, beating a dead horse here, but it seems like the one difference is where the funding comes from.
Yeah, but look at the things you mentioned. They may be large compared to somebody sitting in their living room, a large platform comparatively, but they're not NBC. They're not on your, for the most part, on your terrestrial television airwaves. So, yes, I am well aware there are YouTube personalities out there that can luckily be anti-war, anti-imperialist. I still have one of my YouTube channels that exists. I have my Patreon where I hope to continue making videos. So I'm not saying that I have been completely deleted or that all anti-war voices have been completely deleted. They've just been deleted from our television airwaves, which, is where most Americans are still getting their news.
Yeah, you were on cable.
Yeah. That's television. Is that not television?
Yes, it is.
Was it on a TV? I thought it was on a TV, no?
But I guess what's also interesting about that is that it's not the government that has necessarily banned RT. It's the corporations. It's YouTube. It's I guess Viacom, Comcast, all these other cable providers and satellite providers.
I think that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, yes, I know some of them were pressured into pulling their distribution several years ago during the Russiagate ridiculousness. By the way, I hate Trump, but Russiagate was, let's be honest, a joke. So some of them were convinced into pulling it years ago, and then there were the two more that pulled recently. But I think that there's a lot of backroom conversations that go on, and I wouldn't at all be surprised if there was some U.S. government pressure to let's tell these corporations to end their distribution of RT America. I think anyone who believes that the U.S. government and corporate America aren't linked at the hip is kind of lying to themselves.
RT America seems to have shut down for good. We never know what the future is, but the early indications is it's unlikely to come back now. How are you responding to that, and what's next for you?
If I can get enough, crowd-funded donors at patreon.com/Lee Camp, then I will hopefully create something that at least has the feel of Redacted Tonight. It will likely never be a large news studio show, but it hopefully will have the same feel and obviously the same points and the same passion. So that's one of my main goals. And outside of that, I continue to write. I have one book out, working on another one. And continue to do videos online and going back to my roots. I spent 15 years before starting Redacted Tonight as a touring stand-up comedian. So I'll do some of that and go back to everything else.
Do you have your old interviews from Redacted Tonight?
Yeah, I'm working on. Luckily, we still are able to get into the backstage, whatever they call it, the portal of YouTube, and I'm working on downloading them all. I mean, that's another point we haven't brought up is that so I had two shows on RT America, and the second one was an interview show, and I was able to highlight these amazing voices of really impressive journalists and activists that get almost no coverage on mainstream airwaves, and also some big ones like Roger Waters, but some ones that are largely ignored, Julian Assange's father, and Ben Norton and Eugene Puryear, and these wonderful journalists, John Perkins, who wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and just great people that really don't get enough time on your mainstream airwaves.
Lee Camp has been our guest. Again, Lee Camp hosted the program on RT America called Redacted Tonight. He was laid off after RT America shut down on March 1st after it was dropped by numerous cable and satellite providers, and now also by YouTube. His podcast has also been dropped by Spotify. You can still find him on his YouTube page, his personal YouTube page, with his show called Moment of Clarity with Lee Camp. And Lee, is there anything else you want to say, how people can find you?
No, those are the main ones, leecamp.com and Patreon.
Lee Camp, thank you for your time.
Thank you.